Welcome to the first ever filming of The Digital World, a media literacy 101 essentially podcast or videocast that's going to go into understanding essentially the ever-changing world that is digital media. I'm your host, Connor Dunwoody, and I've essentially been in media for the better part of a decade, whether that's on the front end of it, being a reporter and journalist, or behind the camera on the back end of it, or even working in social media related roles or marketing positions. I've worked around media for over a decade, and I've studied a lot of how misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation works. And we're going to focus a lot on disinformation throughout this podcast video series. So there's a lot of examples of it and a lot of ways that we need to continuously be re-educating ourselves on how to keep up with it. Because essentially, online and the digital realm is a crazy, crazy world where anything goes. That's one of the beauties of it, is there's so much freedom to say what you want and do what you want. But that also comes with a very a second-handed thing. Anyone can post what they want. And that gets really dangerous when it comes to bad actors posting fake and purposefully wrong information online to try to invoke some sort of emotion in people. So essentially, that's the hope for this podcast, is to give you tools in your everyday life to recognize disinformation and misinformation and malinformation online, and to help you educate others. So if you hear someone go, "Oh, did you know this? I saw it on Facebook," you go, "Well, hey, I listened to this series and they've debunked that, or they've showed me, or they've showed the skills to, let's look into why this is that, and let's see if this is really a true thing." And, the people listening to this, disinformation happens to everyone. You may think you're above it. You may think, I know how to spot these things on the internet. But I can guarantee, as the world changes and we grow more heavily of a digital presence online, especially with things like the metaverse or digital workspaces or growing social media platforms, everything from, the rise of TikTok to YouTube to, the typical Facebook, you've probably encountered some sort of fake or unreal thing, and you've probably interacted with it before. So this whole series will be to help you navigate through these waters and help you help others navigate through the waters that is the changing digital world. So without further ado, I kind of want to get into my first topic, which, I know, crazy fun. It's going to be misinformation versus disinformation versus malinformation. Then we're going to get into some of the juicy stuff, like the Internet Research Agency, and we'll hopefully have people on throughout this series who know their way around the digital realm and can help show processes, whether it's, reporters or anchors in TV, how their process works to cause more transparency there, and have conversations about things that they can do better in the industry. People who have studied this as well. A lot of people have put time and efforts into understanding, disinformation online and bringing awareness about that. And there's been some incredible reporting done. But again, we're going to hopefully have people like that on through this series, and when we don't, you're just going to get me talking about random topics in the media literacy field that I want to talk about. So let's get into the first one. The first one, misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. They sound the same. You probably have used, misinformation and disinformation almost synonymously with each other. You probably not realized that they're two different things. Probably haven't even heard of malinformation. If we're being honest, you probably never heard of that. So that's going to be the third one we're going to discuss. So let's just jump right into it. Misinformation is the false or inaccurate information, regardless of intent. So you could tell someone, hey, my fundraiser, I raised $500 and you only raised $400, and you might not know that, but spreading that information is misinformation. This is honestly really common with agencies such as news outlets. Misinformation. There's not a lot of the time, I can't speak for all agencies, but a lot of the time, what I saw in local news was misinformation. For example, I accidentally put the wrong location or the wrong time in a story. A lot of the smaller details like that usually don't have malintent or, bad intent behind it. I'm not going to say mal. I don't want to confuse you. There's a lot of examples of news organizations publishing wrong information and then, going back to correct it. And the big thing is that there are those corrections, but how we go about corrections is going to be one of the things I'm hoping to talk with a future guest about, is how the news industry can change with handling corrections. But, a lot of the time, misinformation does happen. And navigating your way through that is definitely difficult when they're trusted legacy enterprises, for example, the New York Times, the Washington Post. And, misinformation does involve bias. There's bias under the misinformation umbrella. But we're going to leave misinformation just for a minute and talk about disinformation, which is deliberately, now this is purposefully misleading or having biased information, manipulated information, propaganda, that sort of stuff. That essentially, and that can be just flat out, not real stuff too. That's purposefully put out there. So disinformation is probably going to be what we talk about the most today as we talk about the Internet Research Agency in Russia. A good way of looking at the relationship between misinformation and disinformation is that all disinformation is misinformation, but not all misinformation is disinformation, because not all misinformation has the intent to purposefully do it. A lot of it happens by mistake. Now, with disinformation, it's very purposeful and it's coordinated, and sometimes it's even used as attacks, as we're going to talk about. And the last one, malinformation, is kind of on its own, but I wanted to bring it up just because it's a term that's used a decent amount. But it's real information that's shared with the kind of intent to cause harm. A good example of this would be sharing emails of someone personally online. The information in those emails is true, but the intent of what they're doing is to purposefully cause harm to the person. And malinformation's on its own from disinformation and misinformation. So just kind of a heads up, if we ever use malinformation, that's what we're talking about. Something that's true but is meant to hurt the person. So now that we've covered the fun topic that is defining misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation, let's kind of talk about how it's used. And we're going to focus today on disinformation, which is one of the most, scary topics to talk about, because it is meant, the intent, as we talked about disinformation, the intent is to hurt, not to hurt, but is to mislead the public. And it can hurt the public because it's not true information. So let's just going to talk through some examples of disinformation. And we're going to talk about the IRA, the Internet Research Agency in Russia, who's a notorious bad actor for this disinformation. They also do a lot of other interesting things, which is, we'll just talk about how they build their online communities and how they, can stoke divide based on what they post, because they can pretend to be genuine organizations. So let's kind of look. There's this awesome article the New York Times did, and I know I don't want to lose any of you by saying the New York Times, because I know with the New York Times, they can have misinformation in their pages and, bias. So we can talk about bias a lot more in later episodes, and I plan on going over, 50 cognitive biases, which I know all of you probably are just jumping in your seat, super interested to listen to. But what we're going to do is we're going to talk about biases later on. But let's just kind of look at this New York Times report called Some Popular Images and Themes the Russians Posted on Social Media. A little bit of background on this article. This article is from 2018, December of 2018, where they looked at how Russia kind of targets Americans on social media and kind of how they do it. Now, these screenshots are from the Internet Research Agency in Russia, and when you first look at them, you realize there is an astounding understanding for what drives conversation in America and the United States. And I'm just going to show you some examples. So let's take a look at this first one. This first one was, actually, I'm going to show you these three that were on the postings. Like, you can just kind of see right there, we have one about, veterans. We have one about skin color. We have one about religion. obviously they know what they're doing, and the text they use is interesting because it's simple but yet effective. And if you're trying to post stuff on social media that goes viral, you want to play to really your lowest common denominator. Just things that are simple that people will read quick and share. And Facebook started to do work on tackling misinformation. They've put down traction on posts that have a lot of text in an image. And Facebook's there's a lot of examples of Facebook working to combat that, but there's still a lot of things that needs to be fixed in that regard. We're not going to go into that in this episode. So let's look at the first example, and I'm just going to read you the post here. It says, like and share if you think our veterans must get benefits before refugees. This was posted in September of 2016 to the Being Patriotic Facebook page. The text of the post said at least 50,000 homeless veterans are starving, dying in the streets. Note that there's no comma or anything there. At least 50,000 homeless veterans are starving, dying in the streets, but liberals want to invite 620,000 refugees and settle them among us. We have to take care of our own citizens, and it must be the primary goal for our politicians. That post on social media got 640,000 plus shares. Obviously, you can see how that stokes people's emotions by talking about homeless veterans and refugees. Russia and the IRA did a great job, and I don't mean great in a good way, but did a great job at finding a wound to pick in America and making a post about it. And one of the interesting things is these groups over time will amass more members as this information is shared, which is why it's so incredibly important to understand misinformation, disinformation online and spot it so you can help combat the spread of it. Let's go over to the second example. This was posted to the Instagram account in June of 2017 to the account Blackstagram. It goes, quote, what is your color? And then tags a couple organizations and then goes on to list a bunch of hashtags so that post can be found. Now, this was a post done by the Internet Research Agency in Russia. What's interesting is this, post didn't look like it was meant to cause any harm. It was just meant to cause conversation. Obviously, a lot of conversation on social media can lead to harm as, people don't see the human behind it and just the screen. But what this is a great example of is how the Internet Research Agency in Russia grows a community. With a name like Blackstagram, that really disguises itself as not an Internet Research Agency organization, just like the last one, Being Patriotic. They do a really good job at hiding in plain sight. And as they amass more followers and a more loyal base, that's when they can start putting out more edgy content, more stuff to stoke a fire and to cause, division and polarization. That's what they're really good at, is building that community. There's someone who I'd really like to have on this series called, her name's Renee DeResta, and she did a lot of look into how the Internet Research Agency in Russia builds communities online, and she has done a bunch of data gathering on this, and we'll go into that in later episodes, but just to see how this disinformation evolves online is just incredible to see the growth over years. This is not a, overnight stardom thing. This is a group that makes, something about one thing, and as it grows, it changes to another thing and another thing as it garners a larger, more interactive audience and community. And that community then can be used to spread the disinformation that they're putting into, social media channels. So it's very interesting to see that. That Instagram post, by the way, had over 254,000 likes. So, these farms, and not farms, but this agency knows what it's doing when it's putting misinformation into the public. And I'm not saying we don't do that ourselves. We do that a lot. But just starting to recognize that and recognize disinformation online is going to be so important over the next century and next, decade, even the next year, as we move into, another election, how we can combat that and how we can combat, the media world is changing, TV news is changing. We get our news from Twitter, YouTube, from all these other places as well. So combating, how do we understand the news that's on our TV and how can we believe it? How can we cite sources? How can we look at other references? And doing the same with YouTube or Twitter is going to be so important. And this whole series, the hope of it, I've said again, is to help you navigate through that. So this is a short episode. It's the first episode, but I'm hoping to have more every week as we dive deeper into the digital world and the ever-changing landscape that is media. Thanks for watching. See you here next time.